So I've been using chainsaw my entire life, in the farm, in habitat management, whatever, and I've just learned more in these few minutes than I've learned in my entire career before then. I've been a firefighter at West for the Bureau of Land Management, and I still learn more now than I've learned. So you've helped me, you're gonna help a whole bunch of habitat managers be safer, be more productive. Today I'm here with my buddy Stan at STIHL Chainsaws, and Stan has been teaching this and working with STIHL for 40 years.
Be 38 in August.
He knows more about this than the rest of us are ever gonna know, so sit back and enjoy, because if you're doing habitat work, you got a chainsaw. Then today, we're gonna learn how to easily and successfully sharpen a chain.
Today I want to go through the anatomy of the cutters before I actually go through all the angles and everything to explain how to sharpen. I want to talk a little bit about the different types of cutters that we have. It's kind of just a preference thing that people look at a lot of times, but I've got one that is a semi-chisel chain, and then I have the other one that is a full chisel. And you can see that the working corner that we're going to talk about is right here. This is going to be the working corner of your chain. One is about as good as the other. The only thing about the semi-chisel chain is if you're cutting in real dirty wood, the working corner will stay sharp just a little bit longer. When we talk about angles of the chain, we usually think of the top plate angle right here because we can see it. It's just visible. We walk up to the saw, we see the angle. And on all of our general purpose cutting chains, that's going to be at 30 degrees. So we want to make sure and keep that chain, all those cutters, right and left, both at 30-degree angle. What that does, when we look at a cutter, you've probably heard your dad talk about or your grandpa talk about an old saw blade on a power saw. Now we have carbide blades or carbide cutters on all of our blades, but on the old steel blades or metal blades, they had what they called set, and one cutter would bend one way, one would bend the other. And what that did was cut a wide enough kerf in the material that they were cutting to make sure that everything behind that cutter would fit and not bind up in the cut. Well, the top plate here does the exact same thing. At 30 degrees, as that cutter contacts the wood, it's going to put 30 degrees of side pressure on the left, 30 degrees of side pressure on the right, and it opens the kerf up wide enough that even if we are into a 4-foot stump and we cut through, we can stop cutting and just pull the saw out. So that's basically what we're doing right here, and it's critical that we get this every cutter the same every time. So we're going to shoot for 30 degrees on either our chisel or our semi-chisel. The next one I want to talk about is going to be the chisel angle, and that's right under here, and that is the angle that actually peels the wood up. And when we cut cross grain, it will peel those chips up and feed them into the chip channel. Now I've got a board here that will show the grain, and if you look at the top grain of this wood, this chain is turning about 60 miles per hour. It's going to be going in this direction here. The working corner catches the wood, thrusts the cutter forward, land on the depth gauge, and that sets up the angle of attack for our cutter to feed into the wood. And it's no different than a wood chisel that you get out of your toolbox. This is just a chisel that's going to cut its way down in. The chisel angle is going to peel up that cutter, and we're going to get a couple of these growth rings right here. The wood isn't very pliable in that direction, so the chain tension is going to snap it fairly easy. It's going to snap off and form a chip. If we cut with it with the grain, we're going to get those big long ribbons that go up under our bar cover because the wood is very pliable in the direction of the grain. So cross grain is going to get you the best result with your cutter. The chisel angle is fully determined by the size of the file and where we hold the file on that cutter. So many times I see people take a bare file and they try to sharpen that chain. And the first thing that they do with that bare file is they push down and put down pressure on the cutter, and they're cutting underneath the chisel angle, so they're not really getting a good sharpening on that angle. That's about a 60-degree angle is what we want to achieve right there. But again, that's fully dependent on the size file we use and where we hold that file on the cutter. The side plate, which is going to be on the side over here of the cutter, is the same thing. If we achieve a 30-degree top plate and a 60-degree chisel angle, we're going to have the perfect side plate angle. And what that does, as the cutter rocks sideways, it severs the wood on the edge of the cut as it's going through, and will allow that cutter to continue to go deeper. The next thing I want to talk about is going to be the depth gauge. And this is one thing that is so many times neglected. People take a file, they file the cutter, they get a pretty good job on the cutter, but they leave the depth gauge exactly where it is. If you look at this cutter right here, you'll notice that that cutter slopes back, so it gets shorter as it wears down or as you file it down. That depth gauge does not change. And for instance, the saws we're going to be using today, that depth gauge needs to be 26 thousandths of an inch lower than the working corner of the cutter. So what that does is determine how thick that chip is going to be. If we don't ever take this depth gauge down, eventually the depth gauge is going to be at the same height as the working corner, and the cutter is just going to stop. And you're going to get to see an example of that at the demo area. We sharpened the chain about halfway back. We left the depth gauge just like it was brand new, and it won't feed into the wood. It just sits there and just cuts, just grinds on the wood. So it's going to simulate about the same thing as a dull chain. If the depth gauge is set properly to the working corner of the chain, you're going to have chips that look like these right here. Now these are a little longer than normal, and that's because it was green pine that we were cutting. If you were cutting hardwood like oak, hickory, elm, some things like that, then those chips would be more square. But the thickness of that chip is the distance between the depth gauge and the working corner. The next example that I have is a chain that has fed into the wood. The operator sharpened the cutter, but they did not address the depth gauge. And when that happened, as you notice, that cutter slopes back, gets shorter as it's filed away. If that depth gauge is equal to the working corner, then you're not going to get any cut whatsoever. But this one happened to be, the depth gauge was about half where it needed to be, and you can see that the chips are much smaller than what they were when it was correct. The last one is when something has hit the working corner and the chisel angle right here. The operators hit the ground, they've hit a rock, they've hit a piece of wire or nail in the wood, and it's dulled the chain out. And you can see a little bit of difference between the high depth gauge and the dull chain, in that there's a lot of powdery dust in this one. So you can learn a lot about the cuttability of your saw just by looking at the chips that you're cutting. I work in the shop a lot of times. Saws come in and they're just full of powdery dust, and we know instantly that that chain has been dull when they were cutting with it. We can tell a lot about the machines by looking at the depth gauges on the chain, of whether it's been properly sharpened or not. All right, we've been talking a lot about the cutters and how the cutters work. Let's talk a little bit about safety. If you look at this chain, it has a yellow tie strap, and the yellow tie strap indicates that this is a professional chain. Many of the loggers will like the chains without the low kickback link because they cut a little bit faster, and they're going to be bore cutting a lot of times before the tree falls. So the yellow labeled chain is good for professionals. If you're a novice cutter, weekend warrior, you're going to get out there and clean up on your deer hunting property, you're going to want the green label chain. If you're cutting with the bottom or top side of the chainsaw or the guide bar, it's not going to slow your cut at all. And as that cutter or as that chain wraps around the nose of the bar, there's a little link that protrudes out and keeps that cutter from getting a bite on the upper quadrant of the bar nose. So it makes it much safer. That's known as kickback when that chain grabs the wood and tries to stop the rotation of that chain. All of the energy from that saw is going to be back and toward the operator, right toward their face. So we want to keep you as safe as possible. The main thing that we want to do when we start sharpening a chain is that we want to try to take that chain back as near normal or in new condition on the cutters as much as we possibly can. If you take a bare file, you're going to have to be really, really good and pay really, really close attention to how you sharpen that chain in order to get it back to a normal cut with your chisel angle, your top plate angle, your side plate angle, and then working corner and depth gauge. As you can see, some of that file is above the cutter, and that's what we want. And that's really hard to do because, as I said earlier, a lot of people take a bare file and the first thing they do is push down, and for lack of a better term, I call this the gullet right in here. They file down into the gullet too deep. And I have seen where people have pushed down so deep into it they start cutting into the tie straps that hold all this chain together. And I've seen chains actually break because they're pushing down with their file. So we need some type of a file guide that we can set up here to make sure that we get 30 degrees, we get the right chisel angle, we get the right side plate angle, and we take the depth gauge down to the appropriate height for the given chain that we're working with. This does everything at one time. It's called the 2-in-1 file guide from STIHL. So as we're sharpening this chain down, not only are we sharpening the cutter, but we're taking the depth gauge down with our flat file at the same time. Otherwise, you'd have to have a gauge. You would sharpen your chain, and you'd have to have a gauge to lower your depth gauge down. So the first thing I want to talk about are some things that we can make our lives a lot easier out there in the woods. I've tried to sharpen a chainsaw on a tailgate of a truck many a time, and we end up pushing this thing right up in the bed, and we finally wrangle it when we get up into the front of the bed there and hold it with our leg and try to sharpen. Kind of a joke there, but we have a stump vise right here that will pound down into a log or into a stump, and we can fasten the chainsaw just by tightening a clamp right here, and it holds our saw nice and solid so that we can get a good sharpening. Okay, so we're looking at this chain, and we have right cutters, of course, we have left cutters, and our tool is set up for our right hand cutters, and if you flip it over, we've got it set for left hand cutters. So you have to flip the file guide over to cut both sides. How do I know if I'm on my right or left hand cutter? So if you're standing behind the saw, all of your cutters that are on the right side, of course, are going to be right cutters. Everything on the left are going to be left side cutters. If you want to know how to configure the 2-in-1 file guide, look at the bird's eye view right here of your chainsaw. And if you look at the saw that we're working with right here, it all is in the same configuration as our bird's eye here. If we flip it over and we look at the other side, you can see that our chainsaw is backwards. So I've got this set up for a left-hand cutter, but I'm going to be sharpening a right-hand side. So we just want to flip this over to make sure that our configuration of the chainsaw and the 2-in-1 file guide all line up. The next thing I'll talk about here is I want to rotate my chain. Now this chain is dull. We've dulled the chain out, we touched the ground with it, and it dulled it out. So what I want to do is rotate around until I find my worst cutter. And when I find my worst cutter, I'm going to mark it with a red marker so I know exactly where I started. That makes it a lot easier when we make a complete rotation of the chain. Once I find that, I'm going to set my depth gauge or my file guide up here, my 2-in-1 file guide. I'm going to set the top plate. Remember we said that we wanted to sharpen that to 30 degrees. I'm going to put some down pressure and a little bit of back pressure. Now remember I said with a bare file you could sharpen too deep by pushing down. This is made to where I can put a little bit of down pressure, a little bit of back pressure to make my file cut good, and I can easily file my cutter. We've got the worst one here. Now we're going to try to file everything else out down until we're into that same configuration. Now if you hear that scraping a little bit, that's because I'm going forward and hitting the back side of the depth gauge. I don't want to try to file or sharpen on the back stroke because you're going to undo what you just did. So we're going to set that at 30 degrees. We're going to give it the last couple strokes right there, and we've got a nice sharp cutter. We're going to go around the entire chain and do the same thing. Once we're finished, we'll switch sides. We'll move to the other side. We'll flip our file guide over to the L side or the left-hand side, and we'll file all of our left-hand cutters. Even if you haven't hit anything, you've been cutting along, those trees are there for 25, 50, 75, 100 years. During that time, the wind has blown sand and grit and dirt into the bark of that tree, and to the point to where I'm sure that you've all seen it. You'd be out there late in the evening and you touch the wood and you see a little spark fly off the chain. That's because that chain is contacting some of that grit. Even if you haven't hit the ground, that chain is still what I call glazed. So we're going to want to take that off at every tank filling. So once we've used a tank full of fuel, or in this case we've used a full battery, we want to go through and hit each one of those cutters 2 to 3 strokes. So we're going to set our tool up into our cutter, and we're just going to give each one of those 2 to 3 strokes. And that will knock that glazing right off of that cutter, and it'll cut like brand new again. Only takes a few minutes to go around your right side, switch sides, go through your left side. Now, let's say that we've cut through a block of wood and we've touched the ground. Once we touch the ground, if you look at that cutter at about a 45-degree angle, you're going to see a glaring coming back at you, and that's because you're seeing the cutting edge of that chain. If you take a knife, a hunting knife, and look at the edge of it, you can't see the sharp edge of that knife with the naked eye. You shouldn't be able to see that with your chainsaw chain either. Now we get to the point, the question is, when's my chain worn out? When we've sharpened it down enough times that we need to replace the chain. On all of our steel chains, there's a laser mark back here at the back that does 2 things. It gives you a 30-degree angle to pattern your top plate angle by, and it also gives you a length that whenever you're back to that mark, your chain is worn out and time to replace. One thing that I highly recommend, you go into your dealership and you buy yourself a new saw, buy yourself 2 chains, buy 2 new chains and alternate those back and forth until they're both worn out at the same time. You'll get a lot more life out of your chains because as they wear into the guide bar and wear into your sprocket, you're going to get a lot more life wearing those 2 out, alternative back and forth. All right, the other thing that I highly recommend, when we change chains, we always want to flip that guide bar over. And our oil hole right here in the guide bar is set up that you can turn it upside down or right side up. It doesn't matter. This is just a label. So every time you change those chains, flip that guide bar around and you'll get a lot more life out of your bar. The other question I get a lot is, when do I change my sprocket? We recommend that every 2 chains, when you wear out 2 chains, you change your sprocket. The wear here on that sprocket will start, and if you wear 2 chains down and you try to start with a 3rd one with that sprocket worn down, it's going to be slightly out of pitch. So we recommend 2 chains, a sprocket, 4 chains, a guide bar, and a sprocket. One thing that you'll notice is that if you're running a loose chain, if you look at this one right here, it's way loose. And if you're running a loose chain, as that chain comes around the sprocket, that's going to try to follow the radius of that sprocket, and it's going to dive into your guide bar, and it's going to wear a place right here, right on the back side. So I'll come around here. What you want to do is hold that guide bar up. So since this is in the stump vise, I'm just going to hold the power head up, and I'm going to tighten this chain up. You'll see the chain move up toward the guide bar, and we want it to just touch, just a little bit more than touch, and we want that chain to pop right back down into our guide bar. But that's a nice chain tension right there, and it's very easy to rotate around.
Stan, I got to tell you, from an early age as a kid, through fighting fire out west to doing habitat management work, I've been around chainsaws my entire life, it seems. And I've just learned more in a few minutes than I've learned in my entire career, other training, whatever I've had this whole way. So I'm very appreciative of you sharing your skills and expertise to help all of us use a chainsaw safer and more efficiently. We can get more work done and take care of our equipment. You know, taking care of equipment is really important, Stan, but taking care of our lives is even more important. And that's where I want y'all to take time to seek the Creator and apply His will to your lives. Thanks for watching Growing Deer.